Hey Enneagram friends, I'm Abby, an IEA accredited Enneagram coach and certified Somatic Experiencing practitioner. And today on the podcast, we have a guest, which I love having guests. It feels so joyful to get to share a space with like-minded people that are learning and growing and practicing what they know in various parts of the world and various spaces in this Enneagram world. And so today on the podcast, I have Lee Fields, who is a certified Enneagram Facilitator. So she works with individuals and groups and organizations using the Enneagram. She's an IEA certified Enneagram teacher and practitioner through the Enneagram Applications program, and she's currently expanding her study through the Awareness to Action International School, certifying with the Narrative Enneagram School, which is where I met her, and then also with Marion Gilbert's Somatic Enneagram program. Lee is really passionate about practically applying the Enneagram to our daily lives, and I think that's really evident in our conversation today. So without further ado, this is my conversation with Lee Fields about applying somatic work to Enneagram work. Okay, friends, we have a special treat today because we have a guest on the podcast, which I enjoy. So then I'm not just monologuing information at you, but I get a chance to interact and really have a conversation that you get to listen in on. So today on the podcast, our guest is Lee Fields, and she is a certified Enneagram Facilitator. And Lee and I met in the Narrative Enneagram world, although she has studied in other fields as well that you'll get to hear about. But I'm really excited that she was willing to be on the podcast today and to be a part of this conversation. So thanks for being here, Lee.
Thanks for having me, Abby. I really look forward to our talk.
Yeah. So there are lots of things that Lee and I could talk about in this Enneagram world, but I invited her specifically to talk about somatic experiencing as it intersects with the world of the Enneagram. You know, sometimes there's so many different ways that we can apply the Enneagram, whether that is in spirituality or facilitating things with organizations, in supervision, professional development, leadership, all of these things. But one of the things that the intersections that has been really transformational for me personally, and also for the people I work with, is this intersection of somatic experiencing with the Enneagram. And so I asked Lee to be a part of this conversation to share all of the wisdom, all the knowledge, and really with this lens of being a fellow student of, both with the Enneagram world and somatic experiencing, you don't ever stop learning. And so active students that are learning and growing and using the skills that we have to help people in the world in the way that they want to show up. So Lee, as we kind of come into this conversation, I would love for you just to share a little bit of, maybe let's start with what is somatic experiencing? How do we think about that? And let's start there, and then we'll kind of go into how you came across it and some of those lineage pieces of your teachers.
That sounds great. Abby, I'd love if you would sort of build the container for us of your experience with somatic experiencing, and then I can sort of complement what your conversation is.
Yes, for sure. So for me and my experience, my first introduction to somatic experiencing was through the Narrative Enneagram. And I don't know if that was your first introduction or if you found it before that.
I had heard of it before that, but it was my first sort of practical experience with it.
Okay. Yeah. And I learned about the Enneagram from different outlets before I had come to the Narrative Enneagram for my certification. And that was the first time people had talked about somatic experiencing, somatics, and I remember coming home and talking with my husband about, this is their lens of, this is the Enneagram, and they talk about it in story and narrative, and I love that. But then also there's this somatics piece, and I remember trying to explain it to him, and he's like, so your body? And I showed him some of the things that we did. He's like, and what does it have to do with Enneagram? So for me, as I've learned more about somatic experiencing, some of the lens that I have, one of the trainings that I have done and the certifications that I've done is somatic trauma therapy, so that I can be trauma informed in the way that I coach. And then right now, I'm also working on a certification that's a somatic stress release practitioner, using mobilization as a means of releasing the activation. And so, kind of the container of how somatic experiencing has shown up in my practice and in some of the live coaching episodes that people have heard on the podcast. Not always, because sometimes people don't always have the shared language to go there. But for some people, often that shows up in having some space to process the activation, to mobilize and metabolize the activation that's coming up in the moment. So whether that is the emotion, whether that is what feels like a stress response, like that response to the stimuli of that stressor. And so that has been a means of like a coaching tool for us to be able to settle into the space, to give it some ability to breathe, to be there with it, but then also to help move that through. And at this point, mostly with breath work. The certification I'm working on right now is mobilization. So that's been a whole new world, and we'll figure out how to integrate that in. But anyway, so that's kind of the lens and the container of how it's shown up in my work and how some of our listeners would have heard about it, in this space.
Great. Thank you. You had so much in there. One of the things that I really wanted to tease out was talking about a shared language. And I think that's a piece that has really been useful for me. And personally, the shared language, the person I've shared the language with the most is myself. Just becoming fluent with my own physical body and the sensations in it and what that is. I lead with Enneagram Type 1. So it's one of the body types, right? And learning how out of touch I was with that part of myself, and yet so reliant on it for how I interact with the world. Learning that there was a connection between like the personality type structure that I have and the sensations in my body and the thoughts that I have and the emotions that I have and the things that I avoid was revolutionary. And learning, starting in the narrative, and then with some other work I've done specifically with Marion Gilbert and her Somatic Enneagram, learning how to have those conversations with myself and understanding how to interpret that or not has been really transformative for me and with clients that I work with as well. But first and foremost, it's been a personal journey, that is still ongoing. I don't want to imply that I have crested that mountain and have the understanding of all of it, but it's, one step and then another through it. But learning how to dialogue with what is happening, learning how to notice it, has really been incredible.
Yeah. And I think even, we think about, there are times when I think about somatics and the Enneagram, especially now learning, it's a gift that you're learning about the Enneagram and somatics together in that program. But the programs that I've been a part of, and the Enneagram is not at all part of the conversation. And so I'm constantly infusing it into it. And there are times when I hold like somatic experiencing in the Enneagram and it feels like, gosh, these could not be any more different. And then there are other times that I think, how would you ever do one without the other, right? That it feels like they're so different and so intrinsically tied together. And I think even, some of what you had shared of it giving us an awareness, the Enneagram gives us this psychological awareness, this awareness of these blind spots and habits and tendencies and fixations and these things that we fall into without very little awareness of where we've come to. And somatic experiencing, our somatics, is the same thing of having an awareness, a language of what's going on in our felt sense, and to be able to dialogue about that, to be curious about that, to consider, to wonder, to hold space for, to be compassionate in the same way that we wonder and consider and hold space for and be compassionate with our personality. And so it's just two different ways of doing that, almost like two different sides of that same coin of us.
Yeah, I totally agree in that building that felt sense vocabulary and not just the intellectual vocabulary, but the physical sensation. I don't even know the word for what it would be, but menu
Yeah,
of
right?
physical sensations that you have, right? I think that the Enneagram is a map that points us to where we are likely to fall into the trance of our habits, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the somatic work at the same time, the thing that they share in common is that pause and that awareness and that noticing. And it just sort of shows us where our habituated patterns might be,
Yeah.
you know. And that's the invitation to turn off the autopilot and become a little more conscious or intentional in our choices. That's the whole thing,
Yeah.
right? It's
Mm-hmm.
not solving our personality type or getting rid of the negative feeling or emotion or sensation. It's allowing what it is, but just being more intentional.
Mm-hmm.
And that's, to me, that's where the two, in the Venn diagram of the two, that's the commonality, right?
Mm-hmm.
Is the awareness, intentionality, and then the action you choose,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yeah.
Or the state that you allow.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
No, and I think even, it in a lot of ways, when I think about how this has shown up in my own experience as well as with coaching clients, like that awareness and what we do next piece, like it feels so helpful in that. And as I teach often in group workshop spaces, one of my favorite places to teach is Sunday school, actually, my free gig. And but oftentimes people will have questions of like, I understand what you were saying about my type, and I don't want to do that either, but how do I stop, right? When there's these aspects of our type that are exhausting for us because we can't stop the shoulds and we can't stop the chatter and we can't stop whatever it is. And so much of the practice and the invitation to kind of lessen the hold that our type structure has on us, I think one shows up in contemplative practices. I'm always like a big proponent of that. We had Reverend Yen on a while back to talk about that piece of it. But also in our soma, having an awareness of the felt sense of whatever emotion and activation is going on below the narrative we have in our mind around our type, So even someone just recently was talking through like, I don't want my day to be filled with shoulds, but I don't, even if I bring some awareness to that, I don't know how to stop the shoulds. And so we had this conversation around, in the moment, presencing, right? So that's just a fancy language for bringing your attention into the moment in real time. And not just your attention on your thoughts, but also your attention on your physical felt sense of what's going on in that space. And your body can tell you a tremendous amount of information about what's going on for you, right? As you notice this rigidity and this tension and this heat sensation or this, buzzing sensation or whatever it might be, and giving you some space to even be curious about, what emotion is coming up underneath this that is propelling this need for all the shoulds, or what need might you have that emotion is telling you, but we need some way to access that. It's almost like we have this gold mine of information and we have no tools to get to it unless we take on some of these practices like the Enneagram and having some somatic language.
Yeah. I'll tell you, one of the ways that developing that felt sense vocabulary was really helpful to me. And I think you're absolutely right about the coming into the moment. I think of that as like facing reality,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like what is now, what is happening
Yeah.
right now, because almost every minute of every day, I am telling myself a fictional narrative about what reality is.
Mm-hmm.
And in my type structure, I'm against most of it and trying to fix it. And in my emotional life, I'm riled up about it and trying to fix it. And in my mental life, I'm believing that this story is true, right? And so one of the practical ways that I've been working with this is noticing, trying to notice in my body what is happening.
Mm-hmm.
Like when I feel my jaw clench, right? That is a sure sign that I am operating in my type structure, right?
Mm-hmm.
I am in the story. And that is a like physical reminder to be like, okay, take a breath. What's really going on?
Mm-hmm.
Right. And it may not be about me, right? Very frequently, it's something out there for me, right? But I had two stories. One is recently, um, someone at my son's school was asking me to take on a task, right? And as I was hearing them say, okay, here are the parameters of what we want you to do. As I was standing there listening to them, I realized that my head was shaking. No, 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 no. And yet I was about to say yes, that I would do the thing, right? Like I was just
Yeah.
waiting for the period. I was just waiting for the end of the ask, already ready to say, sure, I can do this thing I do not want to do. Right. But I realized I was I was already talking to myself, right? And I was about to, I mean, this is heavy language, but I was about to betray myself in that
Yeah.
moment to say the thing I ought to say. Because why wouldn't I help with this thing?
Yeah.
Because I don't want to, and
Mm-hmm.
someone else can,
Yeah.
right? So I was, it was sort of awkward situation then in the end, because I wound up laughing out loud at myself. I'm like, you were about to say yes. Oh, and now I realize that it seems like I'm laughing at your request, which is like, sorry, split screen, thought of something else. I can't do this thing. I'm sure you'll find someone who can. And then I still partially derailed myself by saying, and if you can't find someone who can, let me know and I'll see what I can do. Right.
Mm-hmm.
It was like, so I'm still, you know, whatever. But it was an interesting moment for me. That was a clue to me to realize you already don't want, you don't want to do it.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Um, and then that invites another question of, well, why don't you want to?
Mm-hmm.
Right. And I didn't have to ask the next question or the next one, but it was an interesting thing. I didn't want to do it because I've done a lot of stuff already and I feel like somebody else should. And I'm like, there's the type structure. I'm
Mm-hmm.
resentful that other people aren't doing their part and I don't want to take it on. And I recognize that if I do, it is going to be completely infused with spite,
Mm-hmm.
which is not how I want to show up.
Yeah.
Right. So no, thank you. I will not help with that. Right.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing I wanted to say was an example actually from one of our narrative teachers. I'm not sure if this was a workshop we were in together or not, but it was a really impactful experience for me in this way. It was Christopher Copeland, gave me some language that was incredible in just like a little debrief session during one of our trainings. And it's a long story, but I'd had a technology problem trying to do a presentation we were supposed to do. And when I was talking about that experience, my reaction to the problem was different than usual, right? Mm-hmm. Like I tried all the things. I turned off the router. I turned off the Wi-Fi. I restarted all the stuff and it didn't work. And instead of just continuing to do those same things and becoming very, very angry and frustrated, I tried it for about 10 minutes, was like, well, that's that. It's not going to work. Right. Mm-hmm. And went and had lunch, walked around the block, came back to do my presentation without the slide deck or whatever. And when we were talking about it later, I was saying it was so strange. The thing I felt was so strange. I was like, it felt like positive resignation. Mm-hmm. And Christopher said, was it acceptance? Mm-hmm. And I was like, oh, I think it was. I think that's what that was. And I was, that day old when I had felt that in my body, like what acceptance felt like, which was really amazing and sad and hopeful. I mean, it was like, it was all those things, right? It was like, oh my God, that is what acceptance feels like. It felt like time slowed down. I was physically relaxed.
Yeah.
It was just like people walk around feeling this, like this is a thing, you know.
Yeah.
um and that the way that really practically helped me in a way that like the mentalized thoughts of acceptance had not, is that the way that I had defined what acceptance was mentally was unattainable. Right.
Yeah.
But feeling what that felt like was like, oh, I've done that. It's like riding a bicycle. Like, oh, I know how to do that. So I can do it, and I can recognize it when it's coming. Like, I'm feeling a little bit of acceptancy stuff. Like, what if we just took a breath and went, oh, all the way acceptance. We can do it. We can do it. We can do it. You know?
Yeah.
and that's where that felt sense vocabulary really comes in a way that I don't think anything else can.
Yeah.
I think anything else is a mentalization or an intellectual experience of it, which is a partial experience. And again, that's where the Enneagram comes in to show the lens we're seeing through and highlights what we're missing.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, for sure. You know, even getting to share this space with you, you know, as you share that story of acceptance, right? I can feel that in my soma too, right? Like this spaciousness and a sense of like goodness and wholeness of like, yes, like this is what it is. And I think that just feels also like, you know, for me specifically in my role as a coach, but for anyone in the spaces that they share with others or they bear witness to others, like it's just such a tremendous gift to get to mirror back someone's somatic experience too, of like, yes, like this is the goodness that we feel, or like this is the nervousness or the, you know, fear, whatever it is that we feel. And so just wanted to name that aloud because that feels like a gift for me to get to witness to.
And I think that part of what that is, I really appreciate that. I think part of what that is that in that moment, we are present.
Yeah.
Right. And it's like, I think it's Russ Hudson who says that your body's the only place you can be truly present. Right. And you have to be, it's what's here.
Yeah.
Right. And as we aren't taught how to do that. Right. And it's not like we, you know, nobody knew how to do it to teach us how to do it. Right. So it's like, but seeing what a difference that makes in the experience of everyday life is just, it's stunning.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And it doesn't have to be like, one of the things that was a handy, like a roadblock for me in starting with somatic experiencing was that it seemed like such a vast topic. Like I didn't know where to start. It seemed kind of, just in its vastness, like that's going to be complicated. Right.
Yes.
Like I don't have time to learn that this afternoon was kind of my, you know, experience of it. But then when we were working with the narrative and it was like sort of just woven into the experience, and it was like, oh, it's not that complicated. There's always more. It's like the Enneagram. It's really simple and elegant and very complex.
Yes.
And very broad and very deep, but you don't have to know the whole thing to start using it. Right. And I think that is really the takeaway for me with somatic experiencing is just start, notice your breath, you know, focus on that just for a minute.
Yeah.
Where are you holding it? You know, and I think when you're talking, we could nerd out about a whole bunch of stuff with the Enneagram, but like, our teacher, Peter O'Hanrahan, has a lot of work on somatics and type structure, and Marion Gilbert as well, like that different personality types hold tension in different ways or hold relaxation in different ways. Like there's just a way that we want to feel, and we go about doing things to feel that way. And as a result, miss some of the other feelings, right? Like I have been learning about myself that my system doesn't feel very safe in a relaxed state. It'll start getting busy doing something just to stay productive, right? Like, and like I can read in a book all day long that ones have a tendency to work first, play later, right? Like, yeah, like, okay, yeah, that's true. But to learn that part of how that is showing up is when I do sit down to take a break, how quickly I'm activated to stop doing that.
Yeah.
Right. And my husband is a 9. He would say he's a champion relaxer. Right.
Yeah.
And he, you know, it's like I'm a hummingbird and he's some kind of sleepy, adorable puppy. And our energies really can clash that way. And it can cause a tremendous amount of friction if we're not, you know, aware and conscious. And I try to learn from him, like you were talking about, sort of co-regulating in that feeling of being in the same space. It's like I can try to tiptoe into his energetic preference and be like, so this is, I'm learning.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
And I have found too that the quality of what my breath is really determines what my experience of any given moment is.
Yeah.
And I know you were talking about breath work in the workshops and trainings that you're in now. That's a game changer.
It is. Yeah. And it also, I mean, breath work can stand alone as its whole separate thing. Like there are like breath coaches, right? And so, I mean, and it's just, you know, it is good though, right? That you just take one step towards it, knowing that you don't need to know the whole iceberg. You can just know the tip of it and that still be okay. But breath especially, I think, is a really helpful introduction. I mean, even with people that I'm coaching that have no somatic language or experience, breath is a common word, right? If people maybe have never given awareness to their breath, but if you invite them into that, it doesn't feel too big, too mystical, too unknown. It's like, okay, what's my breath doing? Oh, it's really shallow. It's really rapid. I didn't realize it was doing that until you asked me to look at it. And I think even there's so many guided meditations that, you know, we use them in contemplative practices in your spiritual tradition and things like that too. But even that can be really helpful. You know, I try to, with like some of the groups I lead, just starting with an arrival practice that is a body scan, right? Where you're bringing attention to each part of your body, either going from, you know, your feet up or head down. And sometimes that of like, for some people, they have never brought attention to the top of their head. Not until I asked them, because why would they? They would have never needed to do that. But when they do that, they realize there's a tremendous relaxing sensation, and I'm holding so much rigidity and tension in all of these parts of my body that I didn't even know it, because I was just shouldering life or surviving or hustling or, you know, grinning down and bearing what was going on in my world. And so just bringing like a whole new awareness and language for them then to be kind and compassionate and take care of themselves, even if they don't have a lot of language to understand why that happened to begin with, or you know, what brought it about in their type structure or their situation or whatever it might be.
Yeah. And I think that, like, pointing to really simple practices, like just notice where your breath is holding, right? Is it easier to inhale than to exhale? Right? I mean, curious, right? And I think that the body scan is a great example. It's like, even if you don't have time to do the whole thing, like I find myself holding tension a lot. And I'll be like, relax your tongue. Just relax your tongue, because it's like frequently jammed into the back of my teeth, right? Like, gonna do this, right? As I'm braced for the next thing. And the amount of like relaxation that comes from one thing, like, you know, if I hold a lot of tension in my face, right? If I can just let my face relax for a second intentionally, then the whole rest of me settles. Right. And I think that's universally true for human mammals, right? Like there's a tension that we hold. But I think that the key with the Enneagram is that there's just an extra level of understanding that can be gained of like, this is probably going to be a problem area for you, or a place where you hold a lot of tension or stress or emotion of some sort, anger, shame, whatever it is. And that gives you a place to start working. So it just sort of shortcuts some of the effort. But in the same way, I think the Enneagram is a good tool, even if people are mistyped. Like, is it ideal to be properly typed? Yes. It's going to be simpler. It's going to be it's going to be a more efficient tool, a more effective tool. But the fact that you're looking at it at all is already a step, right? And the journey of being able to see yourself through this lens or that lens, that's still self-awareness and doing personal work, right? And I think that the same is true with the somatic stuff. You don't have to know the right way to do anything to start doing a something, you know. And one of the great things about working with the body is that it can have very quick payoff and very practical things. Like, I think the Enneagram is beautiful for like deep, introspective, transformative journeying. And it's also great for, I'm having suffering right this second in the real world. How do I get through the hour between dinner and bedtime without losing it today? Right? And there has to be something in this that would help, right? And there is, but it isn't necessarily, contemplating giant moves, you know. It's like little micro things. Like, if I take this breath and realize that I am angry because this is not going how I wanted it to go, and instead I'm going to say, like, I'm accepting that this is not going how it's going to go. So the next part, there'll be a little less suffering for me and everybody else if I just accept it. Right. But I'm noticing I'm still arguing with the past and how we got here and the imagined future and where this is going to go. Be just like, just this 1 second, you know? So sometimes I'll ask my son, because frequently it's during that, you know, after school homework, dinner, bedtime, like gauntlet, I find myself to be humorless. Right. And so I'll ask him, tell me something that made you laugh today. Did you laugh out loud ever today? No. Well, let's Google a joke, right? let's find something to laugh at, because there has to be something to laugh at. Right. Or is it funny that we haven't laughed at anything? No, that's not funny. All right, let's play a funny song and dance silly. Right. And that kind of thing gets us moving, and it shifts whatever the energy is. It doesn't have to be so prescriptive that, like, I'm feeling anger and so I need to do exactly this. You know, it's like, there are things that are helpful. If you're feeling anxious, there are things you can do that would help anxiety. Right. But even just moving and shifting and changing is going to shift and change it. Like,
and even just bringing awareness to it sometimes. Like, sometimes that is amazing to me, of like, I didn't actually do anything. I just noticed that I was angry, you know, and for me, type 8 structure, anger feels like comically always the problem. Like, even when I think it's not, I'm like, dang it, it's still anger. Like, why is anger always the problem? But, you know, for me, when I was like first getting a sense, you know, being able to sense into my felt sense and having some more language for that, One of the things that was so helpful was just having an awareness of when I was angry before it ever came out. Because what would always happen was I would feel angry, but my type 8 structure in total denial of any vulnerability, emotion being a vulnerability for me. And I would filter that out, and then I would say something way more confrontational or controversial or commanding or demanding than I intended to, or even that I realized it sounded like. But even when I was having more language in Enneagram work of like, okay, I know this is a tendency and I don't want to do that, but I would just blurt things out, and then I'm like, crap, I'm angry, and I didn't know I was angry. And the reality was I was actually angry for a good minute, 5 minutes before I said anything, but I had no awareness of it. And so when I could sense into, this is what anger feels like. And once I had a felt sense of what anger felt like for me, it's this hot sensation, and it travels from my feet up, and it feels like a building of energy, like I'm almost like you're puffing up a balloon with like heat and tension. And once I could name that's anger, I was like, how in the world have I never noticed this in my body before? Like, I've been doing this for 30 plus years. Like, why did I not know that I was angry for these minutes, not even just seconds, like minutes before I ever said anything? I was just surprised that I was angry, or I was surprised that it came out that way. And so now that I have this sense of like, okay, you're getting angry, you're getting frustrated that your kiddos are doing X, Y, Z, that this thing is happening in the world, that whatever is going on, and just taking a moment to bring awareness to that and to name the anger. In my mind, I will say, welcome anger, because the reality is nothing wrong with my anger. I'm allowed to be angry. It's how I choose to react from that is my choice, because I paused. And so in that, bringing some awareness and one of the mental, so bringing awareness to it is great. And then for me, one of the mental practices that I do is I imagine that intensity going out of my feet into the floor. And it's almost the sensation, it's your mind's eye, right? It's your imagination, but it's almost a sensation of regulating the intensity of my type 8 structure so that I can come into the situation with more grounded presence, and so that I'm not overbearing, or I'm not too fast, fast moving or forward momentum. But even without the practice, bringing some awareness to it of I'm angry, so what do I do, right? I take a few deep breaths. I choose to walk away. I give myself some space to come out of that reactivity, because however my type 8ness shows up in a reactive way is not going to be honoring of who I am, right? Of who my true self is, and that showing up in the world in the way that's honoring of who I am.
Right. And I think that pause and that awareness that you're talking about really allows us to discern, when is it appropriate? Like, when is that anger clean fuel?
Yeah.
Right. Because sometimes it is. Mm-hmm. Right. It's not like we're trying to solve the personality or get rid of it or fix it. Sometimes we're using it in an adaptive way, and sometimes we're using it in a maladaptive way. And you really got to take a second and see where am I?
Yeah.
Right. Because I think that this is one of the sort of pitfalls of learning the Enneagram, is there's sometimes this sense of, well, now I can't do my personality anymore. Like I'm trying to recover from
or get rid of.
Yeah. Or anytime I catch myself, anytime I see the personality at work, then it's like, oh, got to stop that. Right. Mm-hmm. And that's not the case. Like it's there for a reason. It's done a really good job up to this point, like, of surviving and like welcoming the gifts of it and understanding the limitations of it. Right. Yeah. So when you say welcome anger, acknowledging that it's there, and then discerning how much of this is called for right here, right? If any.
Yeah.
And for me, my relationship with anger is frequently kind of looking underneath it to see what else is underneath there. Right. Because I feel it as anger. I feel that physical sensation. I feel it as a a tension, a pressure that is increasing, and I feel very braced.
Yeah.
Right. Whereas if that anger is like, if I'm using it in like the superpower sort of way, the energy feels less braced and more like forward momentum, like there's a specific word I'm looking for that is failing me, and I am angry. It's like I have the energy to do this difficult thing ahead of me.
Yeah.
Like
a
that
vitality.
Sort of, like a vitality, a momentum, a forward projection.
Yeah.
Right. The bracing of anger is more, I'm back on my heels and ready to tangle with this thing instead of engage with it. Right. And that's some of how I'm playing with it. Right.
Yeah.
But with this somatic language and this felt sense awareness, I am able to practice and practice and practice and practice. When I first feel that anger, a lot of times it's really fear or sadness, right?
Yeah.
And I'm mad at something, but just the next layer down is I'm really sad.
Yeah. And
I'm trying to avoid feeling that because it's harder. I'm more practiced with anger. And I know there's a lot in the Enneagram literature and teaching about one's not being comfortable with anger. I'm not sure, that's not exactly my experience. I will rename it 1,000 different things, and frustration is one of the things I will name it. But it's like I'm familiar with the sensations of anger, whether I'm comfortable expressing anger or not.
Yeah.
Right. So yeah. I think we could talk all day.
I know. But I so appreciate like just being in this space. I truly do feel like we could talk all day, but I also, I feel so appreciative of being able to have this conversation of trying to combine these, what feels like two huge schools of thought and practices and modalities for, like wholeness. And also I feel like in some of our, talking through giving some like personal application, right? So if you're a 1 or an 8, you got a lot of things. But also having some practices of like, how do we start into this world, right? And so starting with noticing your breath, starting with noticing, that activation, start with even a body scan, right? I mean, one of the things I, posted recently on the podcast was just a guided meditation of a body scan, and it's 6 minutes. You could do it in the car. Just keep your eyes open. Yeah. But even just some of these things to start bringing awareness to it. And this is also a really great space for those of you that are listening to have a practitioner with you. So Lee, will you tell us a little bit about the work that you specifically do in the Enneagram world, some opportunities that people can, to enter into the work that you do and to partner with you in that?
Sure. I work a lot with individuals, like people who are trying to find their type or who have found their type and are trying to figure out how to practically work with the Enneagram now that they've landed on a type. And a lot of that work, people come in with a focus on relationships with their family members or coworkers or whatever. I do teach and work with small groups and businesses as well, but a lot of my work is one-on-one and on Zoom in this part of the now. And I am excited about working with people who really want to work with it. So the easiest place to find me is at my website, which is enneagrammatic.com. 2 M's like grammar. Yeah, that's where I'm at. Yeah. I really appreciate the conversation today, and excited to be in conversation with someone who's doing this work, because I think it's so important. And like I say, personally and where we find ourselves in this world, it's good to be working on. Yeah, for sure. You.
Yeah. Thank you so much for being here. And all those things I will put in the show notes that everyone has easy access to it. But thank you so much. It feels like, it is such a gift to be in the Narrative Enneagram spaces, learning together. But then once you are done and you're done with the sessions, you're certified and all those pieces, you forget how good the goodness of being in communion and relationship and connection and conversation around these things that we're passionate about and hopeful of, right? We're hopeful that we're moving towards these things, and so thank you for being here in this space. So
thank you. Yeah. Thanks for having me.
Hey, Enneagram friends. Thanks for listening to the episode. Thanks for being here and being curious. And I hope that you gleaned some wisdom and some golden nuggets of things that you can begin to practice and apply in your everyday life. If you found this episode helpful, would you do me a favor and share it with a friend? Just share the episode, share the podcast with others. That's a really great way to have a shared language around things that you're learning and you're growing in, you're being curious about, but also that helps people find the podcast as a resource. Okay, friends, till next time.